The Bear Roars Special Edition series Bandwidth serves as a platform to celebrate the people and stories of Dan's book, Bandwidth, the untold story of ambition, deception, and innovation that shaped the internet age and the dot-com boom. The story covers the epic journey of the creation of the internet backbones, the building of the early competitive fiber networks in the 1990s, the bandwidth boom, bust, and resurrection, ending in 2020 when Dan's company, Zayo, was sold. The book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Head to dan-caruso.com/book for more details. In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan sits down with Frank Louthan, managing director at Raymond James and one of the longest-serving telecom analysts on Wall Street, to look back at the wild ups and downs of the fiber and bandwidth industry, from the dot-com boom to the crash and eventual comeback. Frank talks about what it was like following companies like WorldCom, Quest, and Level 3 during a time of big promises, shaky business moves, and market frenzy. He and Dan dig into the red flags that got overlooked, the collapse that followed, and how companies like AboveNet and CenturyTel quietly rebuilt the industry with focus and long-term thinking. They also reflect on how the lessons from that era still matter today, as AI, cloud, and new technology put fresh demand on the same networks. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
Frank, this is going to be some fun here.
Yes, it'll be great. Great to see you.
Yeah, fantastic. I look forward to seeing you in person. It's been a number of years since we were in the same room together. So look forward to that happening this year.
Yeah.
Sometime soon.
Well, really appreciate you having me on the podcast. I think you do a great job. I really enjoyed the book, reliving a good part of my early part of my career in reading through that. But I look forward to the conversation today, wherever you want to start.
Well, let's first start with your what's behind your shoulder. Tell us about that red phone.
Oh yeah. This is sort of my my telecom museum here of all the things that I've kind of collected over the years, a bunch of old BlackBerries and things. And I found that old payphone at a flea market. Supposedly it works if you don't plug it into a digital jack, and then some of these others, and then other mementos like from Global Crossing from an analyst day where they gave us some piece of undersea cable and other things, and from that kind of little things to discuss, and old lesson from a business school professor, just kind of have a bunch of colored shiny things behind you and people just kind of focus in on what you say. And so this is kind of take all of the things that I'd collected over the years covering telecom and put it into a background.
Great. Well, I have a similar case that I'm looking at over my computer screen where I have a lot of my old artifacts as well. So very cool. So you sent me a note about a week ago in preparation for this that gave me a better idea of your early history and kind of when you entered the world of covering these bandwidth companies and how you've been involved with that for quite a long period of time. So you entered this really right toward the tail end of the boom cycle itself. Is that the right way to think about it?
I became got promoted to be a senior analyst in 1999, and we had another analyst, a guy named Frank Murphy, that covered, and he was covering WorldCom and some of the other names like that, and he covered all the CLECs, right? Which I'm sure we'll talk about that part of the telecom blow up as well. But he covered all the CLECs, so we said, hey, why don't you come over? We need to expand the coverage. We'll focus on some of these rural LECs. They're actually really interesting. They've actually got free cash flow. Not what a crazy idea, and things like that. And we're going to expand the coverage. So I came over, and my goal was to take up coverage on all those smaller rural phone companies, which I did. A lot of which now are also part of Lumen because they all got rolled up by CenturyTel and CenturyLink and so forth. But I covered those, and one of those companies that I covered was Cincinnati Bell. And while I'm doing my work on Cincinnati Bell, this announcement, hey, these guys are buying this IXC network, and they renamed it Broadwing. So because I covered Broadwing, and Frank covered a whole other part of the sector, then I said, well, there's some of these other fiber companies that are coming out, I'll pick up coverage too. So I picked up Global Crossing and Quest and Wiltel. And those companies, and so that's kind of how I was much more directly connected to the fiber part of the world, which is really the part of the telecom boom that had the assets. Then the whole other part of it was a part that were more asset light, which were basically regulatory arbitrage in reselling Bell networks and so forth. But that's how I ended up covering all these fiber based companies.
Yeah, but we're going to come back to the companies you've already mentioned. But before we do, let's move forward with you a little bit and start naming other names of companies you covered, that are part of the bandwidth story, part of the fiber story, bringing us up to kind of present day. What other just names
Yeah.
of companies that you
Yeah, I
spent?
covered TW Telecom. I covered AboveNet until you took them out. I had a great call on AboveNet. I covered them for about a hot minute, less than a year before you guys bought them, and it was one of those ones where the stock almost went kind of straight up towards my price target because I didn't that whole time. But I covered them. Let's see what else. Of course, covered Zayo. I met you guys, way early on. Before when you were private, and then we were on the IPO and covered you guys until you went private, and then let's see, I'm trying to think of the others that
Level 3 Quest.
Level 3, yeah, I covered Level 3 Quest, Global Crossing, covered CenturyTel, CenturyLink, Embark. I covered Commonwealth Telephone that has some roots with the Kiewit folks from CTEC. I covered RCN, I covered WOW, I covered Knology, covered all the cable companies. I added up once, and I think it's 73 or something public companies that I've covered over my career. But pretty much all of those that other my little list here: Electric Lightwave, Earthlink, Echelon, covered Frontier, GTT, covered those guys. On Paytech, those US LEC, some other Talk America, covered TDS at one point, US West, Valor Telecom, on down the list. And pretty much if it was a publicly traded LEC or CLEC at some point, I covered them.
And WorldCom, did you directly cover?
I did not actually cover WorldCom. I was involved with it, paid attention to it, but that other analyst at my old firm had, but that's now part of, it was the old First Union, that's now part of Wells Fargo, had covered WorldCom. But I was right in there. I went to their analyst days and paid very close attention to what they were doing, but I never actually covered them. And then when I came to Raymond James in 2001, I didn't. That was not one I could kind of see the writing on the wall. I remember distinctly having a conversation with a UK-based investor who I was discouraging him from owning WorldCom, and he just couldn't understand how I could recommend a basket of U.S. telecom stocks and not have WorldCom in there. And I said, I just think they got too much debt. And about 2 weeks later, they filed.
Yeah. The right answer is you probably shouldn't have been recommending any of them at that point.
Probably, yeah.
But you had been the only one not to have been. So,
well, and one of the ones, the Quest was the one that was the most interesting because I launched on that as one of two analysts with a hold, and that turned out to be entertaining.
Yeah, because a hold sounds benign for people outside of this world, but hold is, especially back then, was real negative.
Pretty much was a sell. There were 30 buys, and there were myself and one other person with a hold on it. And at that time, when you would launch on a company, you would tell them, okay, hey, here's my rating, here's my price targets coming out, and that got quite a visceral reaction from them. So the CFO and the head of investor relations spent about 45 minutes on the phone trying to convince me that I had the wrong rating, which only convinced me that I must be right. And finally, they told me that, well, once you get to know this company a little bit more, you'll see why we're worth $55, $65, or $75 a share or more. And the stock kind of went straight down from there. But
okay, so now let's go way back, and then I'm going to go back further. Okay,
yeah.
So I'm going to start when you were first entering the senior analyst, beginning to cover this collection of stocks that are associated with fiber networks and competitive telecom. How old would you have been back then, roughly?
I'd been about 30 years old.
Yeah, so kind of like a 30-year-old that's getting started as an analyst today and is assigned covering AI. That's
right.
Kind of the equivalent. So you're there.
Yeah, that's the equivalent. This was the hottest sector, and jumping in, everything was doing great, and I was getting an opportunity to step in and cover names, and especially the fact that I was getting to cover some of these fiber names was really exciting at that point in my career.
What do you remember? Can you remember kind of the emotions you were feeling at that stage? I mean, I'm here in the thick of all this craziness going on, and all these companies are booming. The CEOs are bigger than life. The ones that are being written about the most in the Wall Street world. what did that feel like for you at that time? Were you able to put yourself back there?
Yeah, it was very exciting. I was grounded a little bit with some of these, older rural phone companies that I was covering, so I was learning the industry from that point. But everything else it was kind of being made up, and there was no real history because there weren't companies like this. The companies that were around that had been, there were some CLECs that had been around that were basically reselling RBOC Bell system facilities for local phone service. That was a different business model, but putting these fiber assets in the ground was completely different. And you could see the internet moving, and you could kind of tell that, hey, this is probably pretty important to the internet if you're going to move all this fiber around. But the thing that I think was, that really when I look back on it, say what really kind of drove that, there were a couple of things that were across all of the pitches for every one of these companies. And one of them was that the internet was doubling every 100 days. And so everyone took that to the bank. I don't think that was actually true, but everyone took that to the bank as reason for this demand. And then everyone was, and you mentioned WorldCom, and and another thing was that everyone was in their pitch, it was blah, 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 and we will achieve WorldCom-like margins by 2002, 2003, something like that. And of course, we all realize now that those margins weren't really real. So you were putting all this fiber in place, and at some point, it looked like they were all competing with each other. And how could we ever use all of this? But the other thing to think about at the time, which is kind of crazy, was everything was put into terms of voice. So we'd look at all of the fiber and look at how many voice grade equivalents they had, how much capacity for a phone call, how many simultaneous phone calls they could do. Because the idea was really we're competing with, we could see that data was going to eclipse voice, right? So at the time, voice traffic was still the majority of traffic. And that was going to switch over, and it did in early 2000s, actually. It took that long. But you could see that it was going to switch. But that was really where the focus was. And then I think the last thing that was how do you value these companies? And I think that was the big question, because they had limited amounts of revenue. A lot of the revenue they had was for selling off IRUs and selling off parts of the network. And so the investment bankers came up with things called gross plant multiples which were basically to look at. So here's the look at all the investment in the network that the Bell system had. That's indicative of their ability to grow revenue. So let's take an equivalent investment here, and that way we can ascribe value to something that doesn't necessarily have any revenue or not much revenue, or is negative EBITDA and so forth, and try and drive the value. So everyone was kind of watching these stocks and watching them go up, and wondering what is happening. And also at this time, you're seeing a change in the strategy, which you talk about in the book, when all of a sudden here's Quest. And why are these guys buying US West? Why are they going and buying these other assets? And so there's clearly something that was starting to crack right about then. And you outlined it pretty well in the book, but they all kind of had different things that were going on. But they were all starting trying to find different bases for their business model.
Great. So now I said I'm going to go even further back. So walk us through your prehistory of being a senior analyst. So what got you to that point in the late 1990s where you're starting to move up the ranks as an analyst?
Yes. So I had I went to VMI, Virginia Military Institute, for undergrad, and came out during a recession and worked for Delta Airlines for a couple of years. If you've ever flown into Atlanta, you've seen that sign that says "Fly Delta Jets." I worked underneath there in the maintenance center for a couple of years, scheduling engine parts, working round the shift things. And I finally had an internal system, and I convinced them that I could do accounting. And I'd had accounting classes. I convinced the cost accounting guy that manager was looking for someone that had experience in technical operations with all the airline parts, because you have to do a lot of the expensing there. So I convinced them I could be an accountant. So they hired me to be an accountant. And then I went to business school, went to Vanderbilt. And as I was coming out of school, I was, wanted to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I had, done a lot of writing, was on editor of my school newspaper. And I had pretty good analytical skills, and it was suggested I should really look at the equity research. They would really value that. And I tried to be an airline analyst because I had the background there. Ended up getting hired to cover sort of with an analyst to cover sort of a hodgepodge of industrials. I didn't want to go work at a big New York bank, so I went with a small regional firm called Wheat First Securities. That then, within 3 weeks, got acquired by First Union, and, and then got the roll up to bigger banks. But from I worked, so I covered IT services when I was initially this little hodgepodge, and then moved to another analyst covering IT services. So I kind of understood the internet and the IT side of the world from that. But telecom was brand new. I did not really know anything about it, but I knew that I was going to be a senior analyst, and I just needed to learn the sector. So then I spent a lot of time talking with executives, not much like I did, with you guys, learning the Zayo business, and just talking and asking questions and going to conferences, and it was drinking out of a fire hose to ramp up on a sector, especially one that had as much focus on it as telecom did back in 1999. But fortunately, since I had covered all these rural phone companies, there was a life after all those other telcos blew up, and kind of saved my career.
Yeah. So again, staying in your mindset of the late 1990s, as the conversation about the internet itself was making its way around the investment world, and what do you remember about your first kind of realizations about this thing called the internet? What it was going to be? How big of a deal was it going to be? When were you first getting exposed to it, and what kind of conversations were you part of in that early stage where you're trying to speculate?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it was really when I got to business schools. That would have been in summer of '95. So I'm about roughly 30, almost 30 years ago. And have to use the internet. My first day in class, professor says syllabus is on the internet. Go find it. Okay, so I guess I'll learn how to do that. But you had a marketing professor that was very early on, and she had figured out how much the internet was going to change marketing, and it was going to change online commerce and so forth. So we watched the growth of Netscape. Had a classmate that left after the first year of business school to go work for Netscape, and those kind of companies. Watched all of those, and then when I got out of school, getting out of school in '97, I can just remember we had one Bloomberg terminal in a bullpen area, and we go by and look at the Red Hat IPO and all these telco and internet IPOs, and just every one of them would be priced about $14, and they'd open up at and go up at $100, $200 the first day. And you see all this value being created, and you could tell that there was definitely a lot of things that are changing. And with the internet, a lot of possibilities. But then you had to say, okay, which of these business models are actually going to work? And that was the thing that we all kind of sat back and thought of, because without covering the sort of .com companies specifically, we were covering the ones that enabled them. And at least our thinking at the time on the telecom side was, there's at least something that's a hard asset here that everyone's going to need. Then the question was going to be, how do the business models work? There was clearly an upswell of demand that was changing, but it wasn't. It was clear how it had changed. It changed everyone's life and kind of perspective on things, how we gathered information, and that sort of thing. But it still wasn't clear which of these were gonna play out. And the funny thing is, if you look back today, if someone had told you back then in, say, 1997 or 1998 that, hey, two of the biggest winners out of this whole internet are going to be Microsoft and Apple, everyone would have laughed, right? And but it's amazing how things change.
Yeah, how about it? And
of course, the Telecom Act of '96 was a big part of that too, because it sort of upended the whole telecom industry, that allowed all this competition and all these other networks to come out and do more than just maybe long distance, and really open that up. And you just see the natural demand for human communication, right? Just like you opened up, hey, hope to see you in person. I mean, people like to connect with other people, and that's what people, I think, intuitively understand, and why the communications part of it, the telecom boom, had such a boom, because people could really see the need for that increased communication, doing it faster, doing more of that, doing in ways to communicate whether it's via email, things like real-time email type communications and messaging and text messaging, and cell phones coming into the mix. all of those are ways that people end up connecting with each other, and that just follows a natural human desire, I think.
Yeah, and in the late '90s, late 1990s, it was abundantly clear by then, 100% consensus that the internet was going to be a really big deal. It was going to be transformational in a very permanent way. Any debate to the contrary would have been, a few years prior to that. The other parallel time-wise with AI that struck me when you were talking is when you said you first showed up to business school, they said, go look on the internet for the syllabus. It's kind of like people have been in business school the last 2 years. Like if you started business school 4 years ago, you probably wouldn't have been really talking about AI in any meaningful way. Maybe it would have come up here and there. But if you started business school 2 years ago, AI would have been everywhere.
A concentration. You would have tried to focus on it.
Yeah. And you certainly would have been using it and talking about it in every class that you were taking. I would guess, just like, when you were in business school, it was probably, marketing class, you're talking about how the internet can affect marketing. You're in a finance class, you're talking about how the internet is going to affect finance going forward. So your timing is very parallel to people who are just, completing business school right now, relative to AI. So,
yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Let's talk about some of these personalities now. And again, I want to talk about them in the context of it's still the late 90s, 2000, 2001, maybe right before the craziness of something's wrong starts to hit. But talk about the personalities as best you can when you first encountered them. Like who did you spend time with in those years that you're like, wow, that's an interesting person. That's a crazy person. That's a compelling person. Which names come most to mind for you?
Yeah, the Joe Nacho is the one that gets probably the most recognition, and he definitely brought a lot of entertainment value to the sector. He was the most outspoken, and it was everybody against the bell. So you had sort of this lineup of the RBOCs, the regional bell companies at the time, which were primarily what became Verizon, Bell South, SBC, US West. Ameritech, I guess, was still around until they got acquired by SBC. But it was and AT&T. So it was everybody against the old guys, right? And so and every one of these companies there was a lot of bravado. They're in every sector and subsector, there were 10 or 12 companies that all needed only 10% market share to make it. That math doesn't work real well. But Joe Nacho was clearly the one that was the most outspoken, and he would say the most outlandish things and make claims. And you articulated a lot of that in the book. Bernie Ebbers, also another one that they just act. And I sat there. Part of a sell side analyst is to sit there and sit across the table from executives and sort of judge whether or not you believe them or look at their business model and so forth. And character matters. And so when you've got a CEO that is standing up in front of groups and all he can do is run down all of his competitors, and there was one analyst day that Quest had. It was in the Waldorf. It was in their big ballroom there. And they set this elaborate stage up, and this is kind of the height at the show Survivor, which amazingly is still on, but Survivor was very popular. And so Joe Nacho played Telecom Survivor, and he set up a torch with the name of every other one of his competitors' CEOs, and he went through one by one and kind of snuffed them all out and kind of left himself standing. I think he had level 3 with like a Jim Crow at level 3 with like a question mark or something like that, and he snuffed them all out. And I'm saying this, all of this is highly entertaining, but you step back and you think, okay, is this really the type of character of someone that you want running a company, or is this going to be a problem at some point? And sure enough, it was. And then also, other things. So the Global Crossing was another one, right? And I met Gary Winnick once or twice.
Let me jump in for a second, Gary. We'll come to Gary in a second. But I want to stay a little bit focused on, so paint this picture a little bit more. So when Joe is doing this Survivor thing, tell us a little bit more about that. Help us bring that to life, because I hadn't heard that story. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Well, it's so for companies who have an analyst day, they usually do them about once a year, or maybe every other year. They bring in, so they invite all the investors They bring everybody together, and this is usually when they're trying to introduce the company. They'll put out new estimates. Usually they do that after four. They schedule the analyst day so the financial part of it ends right after 4 o'clock. So then they give you all the new financial information, the new guidance after the market's closed. But they and then and there'll be a ballroom with it could in this case this probably had 300 people in there, and there's 25 or 30 sell side analysts and the rest.
Yeah, I've been through a couple level threes. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah, 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 a couple of interesting ones from level 3 as well. But that the story about the comedian that they had up one time. But they set the stage. So then you go up on the stage, and then out walks the CEO, and he's dressed in like he's on a safari. He's got the tan vest and the tan kind of safari hat. And literally they've got it all laid out with they put a lot of detail into this tiki torches and things that are kind of elaborately out there, and they had this big huge banner that comes down and said telecom survivor, and literally they had a name for each one of these. And then this whole point was they were trying to make, he was just trying to be dramatic, make that, hey, Quest is going to be the winner, we're going to beat all these other guys, they don't have a chance. And I can't remember who else they were picking on, but I do remember that level 3 was the one that they kind of had the question mark of, and a couple that had kind of already gone away and disappeared, and had some problems, and he just and that was it. But the whole point was that you're, as a publicly traded company, you should have a lot of good things to say about your company, and your pitch should not be to run down everybody else. But his whole point was how they were better than everyone else, and they were going to end up being the ultimate winners and the ultimate survivor. And this and which ended up, I guess, in a way they're still around, but they had to get acquired to get there and go through a few management changes.
And we'll get into what happened with Joe later on. Anything else that you can remember when you were first getting introduced to Joe, seeing him in a context like that? What else were you reading into that at the time? I know tainted by what happened later.
It just didn't seem trustworthy to me. Just did not seem trustworthy when and anytime you would ask a question, it was one of those, and he would just push back at you, really, really hard. And that's if you look at, that's a negotiating tactic. If you ask somebody something and they blow up and yell at, how dare you question my, then it's a way to push the other person back and get them off their game. And I could kind of see that. But at the time I sit there and I would look around and go, at the time I doubted this a little bit because I was very new to this. I'd only been on the street a couple of years, only been a senior analyst for this is my first year being really a senior writing analyst. And I look around at all the other guys in the industry that have covered the sector for so long, and they all can't be. I'm make sure I'm not missing something here, because these guys aren't stupid and they all must know something. A lot of investors would tell me they didn't like what these guys were saying, but it didn't really sit well with me. Anytime those guys would act that way. And there were quite a few of those other personalities like that. And then as the wheels started coming off and you would push them more, they would get really upset and push back at you. And at which point you could tell there was definitely something wrong.
Yep. So now you started to mention Gary Winnick. So tell us about Gary Winnick. Again, trying to put
I met him only met him once or twice, and it was briefly. But you mentioned in the book they had the office in Beverly Hills, and that is probably still the nicest office space that I've ever been to ever. It was just, and I'm thinking, wow, this is just an incredible amount of money that they're spending for a company that's losing all this money. And so I went there, and you had a whole, I brought our whole team. We had some other, a fixed income analyst and converts analyst and I don't know, and so forth. They all went down to visit them, and met with them and spent the whole day. And they kind of gave us the whole song and dance. And at that point we were kind of Johnny come latelys. They are clearly already public and had all their analysts that they were tight with, and then they kind of talked down to us a little bit. And then when we were one day, I remember distinctly, we were leaving. They told us that the cab could pick us up down in their parking deck, and I go down and there's all these rows of Bentleys and other things, and this painted brick floor. And they had a parking lot attendant down there. The taxi cab that came in, I thought the parking lot attendant was going to lose his mind. This thing is, old beater coming in. It was probably leaking oil on their painted floor, and the guy could not get us out of there fast enough. And we took off. But then after that, one other interesting thing that is very telling is as it came in, I'm working on my model and I'm sending it to him, and the investor relations person at Global Cross says, "Hey, why don't you fax that to us instead of emailing it? That way there's not a record or anything." I thought, that seems a little odd, but I'm not doing anything wrong, so okay, I'll fax it to you. But he specifically wanted it that way. And then again, we get back to the cash revenue and cash EBITDA, which I just couldn't believe were the actual estimates. And then I looked up, and sure enough, if I didn't have a cash revenue or cash EBITDA estimate, it wouldn't be out on First Call. First Call is the national system that reports everybody's estimates, and investors get it, and that's kind of the standard for where consensus estimates are. So if you're not on First Call, you kind of don't exist. So I had to put them. But I thought, that's, again, how are these guys pushing all of this? And it was really, I don't know. So you sit there and go, none of that really seems right. But that was sort of the norm, and what everybody was. And I think I probably had a buy rating on Global Crossing, and WillTel and these others. I did not for Quest, and rode that one all the way down. But that one I had a little bit more fun with. But that was, again, so this is in at this point we're talking 2000, sort of fall of 2000. When I was launching on those guys, and the wheels were starting to come off. I mean, within a year, everything kind of went way downhill. And and I launched on level 3 a few years later, but I was watching those guys.
Okay, and the wheels coming off. We're going to spend a lot of time on that.
Yeah,
a couple more personalities. Bernie Ebbers. Like, what's your memories of Bernie? I know you said you weren't covering them, but he was obviously
you go to the analyst day, and he's got the whole aw shucks thing, which I'm from the South. I get that, but it just seemed fake. It just didn't seem real. And then I knew to talk to too many other former executives that had sold their companies to him, and everything they did was just, "Frank, these guys don't know what they're doing." I said, "What do you mean?" "We had this elaborate software system to track all of our numbers, and they scrapped it. And they have a whole group of data entry group in Jackson that's hard coding everything into spreadsheets." And so later, and they told me, and the other thing that people told me was that he was an absolute maniacal micromanager, and he was had treated people terribly. And you had one story in your book about the guy brought on his boat for the weekend and fired him the first day, and then he was stuck on his boat with him for 3 days. And he used to, like to kind of torture people for that. That, again, not the type of character you want running a company. And that was another one. If you ever questioned, I was on some calls with the CFO, and if you questioned anything, it was just this visceral pushback. And he would always talk about CFO. "Oh, he knows everything. This guy makes the numbers dance." I mean, he said that over and over. But everyone said all he knew how to do was cut SG&A. And these people would tell me, he said, "I'm getting voicemails at 2 a.m. questioning some small line item on," and I'm a 3% subsidiary of this company that he's acquired, and he's torturing my G&A line and leaving me voicemails screaming at me at 3 a.m. about why these expenses are there. And I said, they go, "Okay, this is not someone that has a handle on this." And you could just tell that it was just kind of doing deals and having to double down on deals and double down. And then when they didn't get the Sprint deal, it all kind of fell apart. But you could see that coming, and you could just kind of see that his character there of just didn't really have a grasp for what he was doing, but got pumped up, believed everything he was being told, believed what he was telling about himself, that he was that important, and that anything he did was going to work. And then, of course, it all fell apart. So, another person that, again, just if you can't trust them, it's hard to get behind them.
Yep.
And one other thing though, when you look back on it, this is really key. He didn't have a computer. He didn't use internet. He kind of had a regular phone, but that was it. And so the takeaway there is if the CFO doesn't act, or the CEO of a company doesn't actually use their product, and he probably should use the product, that's probably a red flag.
Yeah.
So how does a guy that doesn't have a computer on his desk really know what's going on when he's supposed to be the guy that's connecting the entire world with the internet?
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. And what's interesting, and let's come back and talk about this, but let's plant the seed right now. What's interesting is there are all of these telltale signs that, with a little benefit from hindsight, it just validated what everyone was kind of seeing and kind of knowing, but we're still 2 years away from the clarity of the disaster that was about to hit. Yet,
right.
It's like, how could you not see this coming from a mile away? And
well, a big part of it was the fraud.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It's just happened to me. I've had a few companies like this over the years where there was clearly some kind of fraud or something, and that's really tough because you're counting on the auditors. You're counting on at least some level of integrity with the management team, and you can kind of see it. But then it's just the idea that someone is doing such fraud and just flagrantly, booking things the way they're not supposed to, or no matter what it was, whether it was the swaps that Global Crossing, those guys' requests were doing, or booking, or really what Nacho really did that he should have gone up the river for was booking the IRUs and not booking them correctly and booking them all as revenue instead of recognizing them over the life of the contract. That's what he really did. That was wrong. But they got him on insider trading. But that's what I thought was more the egregious thing. But all of those things you see these companies do, and it's hard to believe that that's actually going on, or that's going to go on for any extended period of time. But apparently it does, and then that allows everything to sort of, again, you can kind of see it unwinding. But in the meantime, the other thing they do is then they start building up a bunch of debt. And then as these companies were, all equity founded, but when, you're selling stock at 25 and 50 and 150, that sounds great. And then your stock's down at 60. And so you do a huge high yield debt deal. And then that, the borrower serves the lender, and that doesn't end well.
Yep. So Jim Crow, what's your early memories of Jim Crow, and what kind of first impressions do you recall having when you were getting to know him?
Yeah, so the same kind of things. I mean, he had a lot of vision, built fantastic networks. I mean, that's the thing that has just hands down, even today, absolutely built the best network of all those companies that we've talked about. That now Lumen owns. Never had every customer, every channel check, everything ever done, built fantastic networks. But the only thing, but it was slightly different. There's your view from working with him as a manager and kind of putting the business together, and then how he kind of approached the street. From my view, the business was always changing. So initially, he built this network, and it was going to carry a lot of phone traffic, and then the network was going to go, and it was going to carry dial-up internet ports, and then it was going to be cable modems. That was the new thing, and the story kind of kept changing. And so from our perspective, they were always never quite hitting numbers, and then always seemed to have an excuse for it. And so from that standpoint, it was a little bit frustrating on the public equity side, because and then the things they would always focus on. Well, we have 90% gross margins. And that was always a big push, but that never really translated, because there's the way accounting works in telecom is all kind of set for the bells, and so there's certain thing, but then you have these new competitive telecom carriers, and their entire income statement is a fraction of what's on the bells. So there's a lot of leeway. It's not wrong. You can put things in cost of goods or in G&A or capitalize it. None of it's wrong from an accounting standpoint, but it can have very different outcomes. For that, and level 3 focused on having very high gross margins. It never showed up on the EBITDA line, and it never really showed up on the free cash line. And then for years they grew EBITDA by taking cost out, and that still wasn't quite really growing the business. So
Right.
So from that standpoint, it was just kind of frustrating to me, because you would kind of ask,
like, what about from a personality standpoint? Again, you're trying to remove kind of what you learned years went by, but when you when you first encountered him, he certainly wasn't like a Bernie Ebbers.
No,
But
you
what
knew
was
he absolutely knew what he was talking about. I mean, he definitely was. He was much more technically versed in everything that was going on, and he had done all this before. And so that was the one thing that you could at least say about him versus, Nacho had come from AT&T and some others, but he had all done it before. And that's where I look at. So you have to have, especially going back to the old MFS, right? So I'm sure we'll talk about Larissa and TW Telecom and you coming from there, and everybody that alumni from MFS were definitely a different group of folks. And Jim absolutely, knew what he was talking about. He had done this before. He knew where he was trying to take the business and what the opportunity was. I think it was just an investment issue, and then the fact that there were so many others at the same time trying to do the same thing that made it very, very difficult. But he had the right vision, and he built this fantastic network. It was a matter of when and how the monetization was going to come. But from a technical standpoint, it was absolutely clear that he knew what he was talking about. He could explain it to you. A lot of you run into lots of times, and I'm not an engineer, don't have a technical background, so I appreciate when people can kind of dumb it down to a level that I can understand a little better. And was absolutely someone who would come in and talk to you about about the business and the network in terms that you could understand. It was just then what the vision was and where the market was at the time. Were clearly he was kind of ahead of that.
Okay, so I'm going to bring out a couple more personalities, and then we're going to kind of get into the throes of, when the turmoil started. But tell us about Jack Grudman, and near and dear to your heart because he was also an analyst. You were somewhat of you're probably more junior back then than he was. He was more seasoned in his career, and he was at the forefront of covering these same companies. What were your impressions of him and what he was doing, and maybe a little bit more broadly, the relationship between, the bankers and the analysts at the firms, and how that situation was in that era?
Yeah, that was a very, very different time than it is now. And Jack was the highest paid analyst on the street because he was covering this telecom sector that was doing all these banking deals. At the time, roughly he was probably getting 10, 11% of all the banking fees. He was probably making north of $20 million a year, and $1998 that he was getting paid, and he just, but anything that if he pushed a stock, it went up, and so what had happened in the 90s. The idea of stock option, so bankers and LBOs and so forth, kind of the kings of Wall Street in the 80s. And then someone figured out that, hey, these executives all have stock options, and if analysts push a stock, then it can make a lot of money for the executives. And so that was kind of effectively what Jack was doing all that time. If you were banking a company, he would recommend it, and if he put a buy on it, the stock would go up. And that worked for quite a few years. The problem and this was before Reg FD, so Regulation Fair Disclosure, where you really, which clamped down on a lot of these things, where you had to have effective dissemination to everyone, which was you were technically supposed to before, but there was nothing stopping you from if a company wanted to change their numbers, their estimates, they would just start making phone calls instead of waiting till after 4 o'clock, put out a press release and file a filing with the SEC saying, hey, here's our new estimates. They would just start calling their favorite analysts. And by the time they got into the third or fourth one, they'd all called all their top clients. And so then the idea of smaller investors kind of got the short end of the stick. But Jack had that information across the board, and he demanded it. And so he was the guy. He would have private meetings. He was at I remember at an analyst day talking about, and I was at a dinner with your board last night and such. So clearly he'd seen all of this. Had companies tell me Jack talks to people. The companies would give Jack the numbers before they put them out. I remember one time I remember distinctly seeing this. For some reason, we could see Smith Barney research when he was at Solomon Smith Barney on our FactSet machine. I don't know why, but we could. So the WorldCom numbers come out at 8:30, at 8:40 or 8:41, about a 10-page report comes out from Jack's team. It had all the numbers, it had models, it had graphs. He had updated his model, updated his forecast, his entire report. Clearly, he'd gotten all of this information the night before, right? So all of this, but then you look, so the challenging part for me, this was really, and I had multiple conversations with investors. They would say, okay, Frank, you have exactly 30 seconds to convince me why I should ever talk to you when I can just talk to Jack. Go. And so that's kind of what I was up against. And now some investors sit there, they knew that Jack was just a cheerleader. But on the side, if you really knew him, he would tell you what he really thought. And, there are a few emails that came out that I think you alluded to that he, and the same thing with some other analysts that ended up in some trouble there, where he had, clearly had a different view than what he was publishing. But he would tell you that on the side, but publicly he would publish it differently. And so there were some analysts that knew that he was just a cheerleader and they weren't getting anything, but it was really hard because he would literally go straight to the company or straight to a board member or find out about an M&A transaction. There was a executive that I know now that had been at one of the New York banks and the head of their telecom team, and he told stories about showing up at a bake-off, which a bake-off is when you kind of, the company gets down to the last couple of they're trying to decide who's going to do the deal, and it's down to 2 or 3 different banking teams. They're trying to decide who's going to be there. And he said, I was there with my team, JP Morgan, whoever was there from their team, and then from Solomon it was just Jack, no bankers, just Jack, and he won. He got the deal because he basically convinced him that, he would be able to push the stock higher and faster. So it was really unfair anytime for the rest of us, because he just he existed in this world of what would be considered kind of insider information, or at least a realm of influence that nobody else on the street really had. The buy side clients liked it. Never heard any of them really complain or cheerlead when a lot of those rules got changed, but it clearly created a completely unlevel playing field. So when he stepped down and was gone, that really, that leveled the playing field for those of us that were playing by the rules to be able to actually have some influence. But it was tough. So again, another reason why covering, Commonwealth Telephone and CT Communications and Alltel and little bitty CenturyTel when they were small was a good thing for my career, because he didn't really come down into any of those names. They weren't sexy enough.
Great. So let me throw maybe 1 or 2 more names out there, and these may be less you could talk about from that era, but the pre-AboveNet MFN. So Steve Garofalo and maybe some of the people that John Kluge had representing MFN. Do you have any early memories of that? Or
yeah, I didn't. I know of some of those guys. I've probably run into them around, but that was predated me, so I didn't really know a lot of those folks from MFN. I learned more. MFN was more after, I got involved in the sector after the deal, and dealt with more of the alumni folks that had worked for MFN. So I didn't really know any of them in particular.
And then Larissa's name came up. TW Telecom, originally Time Warner Communications, Time Warner Telecom. When did you first start getting exposed to that, or was that down the road when?
Yeah, no, I think I can't remember when I initiated coverage, but it would have been in the 2002, 2003 timeframe or something like that. So I know it was while I was still in Florida, and met Larissa and her team. I thought that Larissa's fantastic. I learned a tremendous amount from her when she was CEO. Of course, having the sales background was great. That's something I've focused on a lot in my career. My dad was a president of a small pharmaceutical company and spent a lot of time around the dinner table talking about him building a sales force and so forth. And so I knew enough about that to be dangerous. And Larissa had sales background and taught me a lot about about that part of the business. She was very generous with her time, spent a lot of time with her team and myself, and they had a very good business. And when you look at everything that kind of fell apart, and then you looked at what TW Telecom had, which Level 3 also had, and then XO, which I didn't ever cover XO but I was working on it, and then they got taken out. But they had the metro networks. And this was the antithesis of all that long haul fiber, right? So I mentioned earlier about the gross plant multiples and so forth. That's what everyone was pushing for those business models. Why? Because it's a whole lot easier. You can see part of this map behind me, but draw a straight line from New York to Los Angeles. You can build 3,000 miles of plant that way. You can build 3,000 miles of plant around Atlanta too, in a circle, but that's harder. You got to there's a lot more logistics to going into a metro area, and it's a lot more complicated. You can build it a lot faster by running along 24 hours a day along a railroad line, and now you've got more plant miles, you've got more fiber miles, and all these other things that were these sort of made up valuation things that a lot of these networks were doing. But you look at a TW Telecom or what XO, or then in level 3 kind of did both and built a lot of metro networks. But there's metro networks where there was a significant amount of value. And where do you do a metro network? Well, then that allows you to get the hop into the building, the hop into the actual customer, and then you can really start competing. And especially by 2004, 5, 6, you had if you need to at least get some long haul capacity from Atlanta to Chicago. There's only about a dozen carriers that you can get that from on a wholesale basis. But you want to get a metro network, get in line. It's AT&T and TW and maybe level 3 or somebody that's gotten that fiber there, and that local fiber became hugely valuable. And then they were actually getting into the business part of the world, as opposed to the other part of the competitive telecom world, which all the LECs that were focused on reselling UNIP, which is the unbundled network elements, to try and resell residential phone service or small business services, which was all regulatory arbitrage. Yep. As opposed to actually owning the fiber into the building, having owners' economics, controlling that network into the building, and so forth. And that had a lot of value. And so that was what I thought. And so that was I thought very highly of their team, and I thought their business model made a lot more sense. And eventually there was probably too much competition for that, and the cable guys came in, and slowly but surely, and it made that more difficult. But they did the hardest route initially is usually probably the right one, and they certainly took a difficult route to build a network, but it created a whole lot of value with it, and she had a great team with her.
Yeah, and only when I was researching the book and then spent some time with her after she read the section of the book, and then she's filled in the gaps, but that's when I really developed the full appreciation for what she accomplished and what they accomplished, because they took something that was all but bankrupt when she took that over. Bankrupt, yeah. They were prepared to shut it down, and took it from pretty much next to nothing to a $6-7 billion exit. So steady value creation growth for many years, between that, early 2000s to the exit in 2000. What was that? Maybe 2010.
2000, maybe it was 2014. Yeah, I can't recall.
It's a Jeff's story, so it's been probably 2015. But a lot of value got created by that team over those years, and it was a very cool team. So yeah, kudos to her. So let's now talk Cincinnati Bell. So you're covering Cincinnati Bell. That's what was Cincinnati Bell when you were first covering them? What was the nature of
that was a really exciting company. When I first started looking at them, they were a mini Arbach. And so you had this microcosm. It was one of these sort of oddballs when you look at how the Bell system got set up. If you look at 85% of the population in the country and the phone lines were owned by the Arbachs, but it only covers about 50% of the geography. The rest of it
really by AT&T. That then got spun off.
AT&T and then the Baby Bells, which then got split up into the Baby Bells, yeah.
So they own 85% of the customers, but 50% of the geography. That would
that other 50% was about 1,100 little small local phone companies, and people don't realize. And there's still several hundred of them that are around. There's been a lot of M&A and so forth. And there were a lot of small family-owned companies. I think there were 135 or something like that in Iowa alone. But Cincinnati Bell was one of them. They were one of the biggest, and they were in Cincinnati, so they were in a major city. They had a wireless business, okay, and this was back when you had spectrum caps on wireless, meaning there was only so much spectrum you could own. So there weren't as many. There were quite a few more wireless companies. They weren't just the big three that you have now, and you were actually limited as how many you could have. But they had their own kind of small wireless business. And wireless was a lot more of a local business anyway. Everybody had to roam, and there were dozens of other regional wireless players, but they had that. They had local long distance. They had broadband, which is DSL, and the other thing that was really interesting about them is everybody liked them. So you would do customer surveys, talk to people. Like, people actually liked their home phone company because it was Cincinnati Bell's, the local hometown guys, but people liked them, as opposed to you have a conversation with someone that was a 9X customer or US West. They didn't necessarily like their local phone company. So you didn't have as much the animosity, and you didn't have, and as a result, it was not someplace that you had as much competition. So this was a tough place if you were coming in as a CLEC, as a competitive carrier, to come in and try and take market share away. That was really, really tough.
And they
so
weren't,
Cincinnati. So that was the.
yeah, and they weren't restricted by the divestiture of the Baby Bells. The Baby Bells couldn't do long distance. They couldn't do certain types of information sources, but Cincinnati Bell was free to do whatever they wanted.
That's right. Yeah. And so they had this, really good business. And so I looked at, so that was really, really, so of all the, when I looked at all the small rural companies that were in small towns and rural America, which I had a good understanding of, the differences of demand and so forth. Then here's Cincinnati Bell, that's in a major, in a major NFL city, and they've got their own wireless unit, and they've got 1 million lines, or a little over 1 million, access lines, and it's a really, really big company relative to these others. And it was very different. So I'm working on that, and then right in the middle, they come in and they buy IXC, which was sort of a broken fiber network. And I found out years later that there was sort of a faction between some of the executives that were there, and Rick Ellenberger, that was the CEO, kind of won out, and he had come from MCI, and he was, you look again, there's a lot of kind of threads in your book about egos and people wanting to, to do things, and I think Rick really wanted to, recreate MCI and kind of, and really, or buy this and kind of throw it at, hey, I'm coming back to MCI, and I'm going to compete with you and beat you at your own game, kind of thing. So I think he really wanted to go, to try and one up the old company there, and that won out, and it was, it was this hot, sexy thing. You buy the, these fiber companies, everybody was getting all this value, so he was going to do the same thing. So he bought what was at the time probably the worst of all the assets, this kind of broken fiber network, but he had a good balance sheet, put that to work, and then tried to make something of it. There was another faction that was trying to buy 600,000 access lines from Verizon, their old GTE lines, I think, in Kentucky, just south of Cincinnati. Now, if they'd spent a similar amount of money and bought those access lines, which at the time, phone lines were still growing, and those lines were probably growing mid-single digits every year of new customers and new phone lines for a couple more years. And they were in more rural areas. It was much more competitively protected. They wouldn't, and then ended up, the company ended up just going down the tubes, and they got crushed with all the debt they put on from IXC. They had built some data centers. They sold a bunch of those off. They also got stuck in the idea where they had a lot of investments in the telecom equipment companies that were there, Corvex being one of the biggest ones. And at one point they would get very upset with me because I wasn't giving them the full value of per share value of their Corvex investment. And I said, well, can I do the reverse if the Corvex tanks? Can I take that out of your share price? There was kind of silence on the end of the phone. But it was a really good company that just lost their way and ended up in a complete mess from a balance sheet perspective because of this big fiber acquisition they made.
Yeah, and they actually changed the name of their entire company from Cincinnati Bell to Broadwing. And if you think about the type of investors, so the type of investors who were investors of the old Cincinnati Bell, now all of a sudden those same investors wake up one day, just like you did, hear about this acquisition, and now they're investors in a company with a completely different profile, highly levered, going to have trouble paying dividends, all about high risk, high growth, and their investor base is like, what just happened?
Yeah, that's called firing your investor base, right? So you come in and you buy it, and they're all going to leave, and so you have to get in a whole new group of investors. And then the other thing that is the dividend went to zero, and it was, and that's a painful thing. That never is a good idea, but it's painful. And then you have all the retail investors and a lot of former employees and so forth, and for months and for years they would call in and yell and scream at the company about why they weren't getting their dividend anymore and they didn't realize it. So it was a mess. You make a big change like that, and it's a complete change. Like you said, you got to be comfortable with more top line growth, and the cash flow goes down or goes negative, a significant amount of capital investment, everything's on the come, it's all pushed out a few years. That's a completely different investor base than what they had. And so that all of that turnover, and then they tried to have it both ways after that. When the wheels started coming off for the sector, they said, well, we've got this base of business here in Cincinnati, no one will ever really compete with us, and we're okay. Well, then the cable companies were allowed to get into the phone business. And so one of the testing grounds for Time Warner Cable was Cincinnati. So they started running phone lines and broadband and so forth in Cincinnati. And because look what else. Cincinnati was historically a testing ground for the entire industry. Look for all the marketing there, Procter and Gamble, Kroger. So there's a whole lot of marketing, a whole lot of test and development, and practically the entire focus group industry was built out of Cincinnati with all those consumer products and so forth. So a lot, and the Bell system would test products in Cincinnati over the years, and because it was like a microcosm. Hey, these guys are safe. I'm not letting Bell South do my testing. I'm not letting the enemy, but these guys they're friendly. We don't compete with them, and it's a good cross section of America. Let's test new products in Cincinnati. And so, and all of a sudden one day I get a call from someone because Time Warner Telecom had mentioned it, and on an earnings call, and we're launching phone service as a test in Cincinnati, Ohio. What? and then all of a sudden, then the walls go up, and I start getting everybody's defensive, and the CFO is very defensive. We're not really, and then all of a sudden they changed how they were reporting, and they were no longer breaking out their phone line, their access lines anymore. And I said, okay, yeah. Something's different in Cincinnati here. There's a reason they're no longer breaking that out. It's probably not because they're growing. Anytime a company changes how they're reporting, it's probably, it's not. Usually something's changed that probably doesn't benefit them. So that, and then that's, and so again, they tried to have it both ways. Like, okay, well, yeah, we understand that this fiber networks aren't doing so well, but we weren't as bad as Quest, and we only built 50,000 square foot data centers, not million square foot data centers, and we're going to sell those, and we've still got this leg. Hey, wireless is still growing, guys. Look at wireless, and that eventually that did kind of save them, but then that game ended because Wireless Gate became more national, and they just had a lot more trouble with that, and it just became more and more problematic until they finally went private and did what a lot of these guys did, which all those LECs probably should have done in the early 2000s, was bite the bullet, upgrade all their networks to fiber. But they didn't do that because they already had levered balance sheets. They couldn't really stomach that. Plus their stock price would go down for 5 or 6 years while they built this out, and they didn't really want to do that.
Yep.
But eventually they did, and they've been very successful as a private company by building out, upgrading their network to fiber.
Yeah, and by the time Cincinnati Bell bought Broadwing and rebranded to Broadwing, it was very soon thereafter that the broader turmoil in the industry began to shed.
It was. I was covering the sexiest sector on the street until about March 2000, and then things just started to peak and started rolling over, and then it just kind of went more and more downhill. It really started with a lot of the CLECs doing regulatory arbitrage, and one of the big games there was called reciprocal compensation, where a lot of these local telcos were the idea was, hey, everything that you hey, large RBOC, SBC, whoever, when you terminate on our network, we'll pay you for it, but when we terminate on your network, you pay us. And SBC looks and they go, well, that's great. These guys are so small. All the traffic's coming from us. How is this going to be bad for us? So they said, okay, that's a good deal. But then along came dial-up internet, which is largely one-way traffic. So then the little CLEC goes around and signs up every MindSpring and every other little ISP you can think of, and they all open up their internet ports dialing directly into the bell. So now they've got 24 hours a day, almost. And then they went around and they convinced all their customers, hey, get a second line. If everyone, maybe people remember this, get a second line in your house for your internet. Don't interrupt your internet by having to dial up. Just get a second phone line. And then they started giving away those second phone lines because they were making so much money with the money that coming in that the Bell system had to pay them. But then that all kind of fell apart because the Bells did what they do best, and they got some lawyers involved, and they decided to challenge those agreements. And whether they won in court or not, they stopped paying for 2 years, and that kind of ended your business model. So then all of a sudden on every earnings call, it was like, oh, this is the best company because it's only got 20% of its revenue from reciprocal compensation. Oh, this one's only got 15%, and it was all going to zero. And then you had all the other competitive providers and stuff.
Now we're moving from subtle signs to all-out chaos. So Frank, what?
Just every quarter, it's like things appear to be getting worse. They want to hang on to the guidance, but they're missing numbers. And then that's when you start hearing about, well, gee, again, we mentioned this earlier, but why is US West, why is Quest buying US West? Why is WorldCom trying to buy US West? Verizon getting into the mix? All these guys trying to make all these different acquisitions that they were trying to do, and none of that seemed to add up. I was like, well, wow, I thought we were these old line phone companies, or these new phone companies, and these old phone companies, they were real problems. Why are you suddenly needing to buy them to make your business work if you had a good business model, with all these new assets and so forth, and none of it really kind of added up. And then but what was really imploding on the other side, as we talked about a little bit, were some of these ones that had regulatory arbitrage, whether it was reciprocal compensation, or the ones that were reselling Bell circuits. So basically the idea was, hey, we have the Telecom Act of '96, so we need to let all these other companies come in, and so Congress, FCC, and everybody in their wisdom saying, okay, well, how do we do that? Oh, we've got a little bit of a framework. So let's go back to Sprint and MCI and how they competed in the long distance world, and they can resell some assets for a while, but then they'll build their own network. So they had all these different phone companies. The idea was, well, we have to allow them to force the Bells to open up their local loops that they're going to be able to lease and sell. And then eventually, once these guys get a customer base, then they'll go back and build all this network themselves, of course, with all that capital. But initially, they got to do kind of a capital light model. Well, that made no sense, because why would you ever spend the capital? And then what they did is they started out with certain prices for the loops, and then they just kept lowering them until it hit the bid. It was like a reverse auction. And when they did, boom, all of a sudden, at that price, that flew off the shelf. MCI was the biggest one, but there were a whole bunch of these other little small ones that were in there. And at the time, you had multiple different telecom analysts. There were some of those that were doing it just for business. That was BLEC. So you had a BLEC analyst, you had a CLEC analyst, you had the RLEC analyst, which was kind of my corner of the world. You had long distance, all these guys. But all of these things started falling apart, because, like I think maybe I mentioned before we got cut off, but the Bells got their lawyers involved. The Bells did a lot of things to gum up the works. If you were a really, really poor employee for the Bell system, you didn't watch things very carefully. You made a lot of mistakes. They had a job for you in the department that transferred over their lines to CLECs, and everything was done by email was around by 2000, 2001, but no, everything had to be handwritten on a fax, and they wouldn't allow, so you would fax it in, and and if there was one mistake, they would send back the whole thing, not tell you what the mistake was. So they did everything they could to make it hard for these guys to take the customers, but they never actually owned anything. And I think, I was thinking about in reflecting back on your book and what you built at Level 3 and then eventually at Zayo and everything else, because you actually were building hard assets. And there was this entire other part of the telecom ecosystem that was not built on hard assets. It was all resale and regulatory arbitrage.
Yeah.
And that didn't work. And
And
so
at the time when the turmoil hit, it first started with the asset light models and the regulatory arbitrage models. And maybe there was a brief time where it's like, well, this is not about the industry. It's about that asset light portion of the industry that was relying on regulatory arbitrage. But certainly all these companies who are building these networks, certainly there must be something there that is of sustainable value. But it wasn't.
And then you found out that a lot of their customer base were some of these asset light models and their traffic, or e-toys, and other things that didn't quite make it from the internet era. Then they were a big part of your revenue, and they went under. And so you still have an asset that had a lot of value, but it was many, many years before it was filled up. And it's actually interesting. One of the things that I think is really fortuitous. There are two slides out of this book that I bring up with investors, and one of them, one is a slide that shows all the spare conduit that Lumen has made a lot of news this year selling. But another one is this slide right after said multiple conduits, only one part of an upgradable network design. And the very last bullet here that level 3 put in this thing was for the reasons you would want all this upgradable network is a combination of unforeseen disruptive technologies. Mm-hmm. It took 25 years, but look where we are now with AI and with all of that we're that's exactly kind of what is happening. You can make some of those things happen before with cloud computing and when 4G, 5G wireless and things like that became disruptive, but they were just very early.
Yeah, and there were just way too many rivals.
Right.
And you mentioned how some of the .coms were customers, some of the asset light. But then what we started to find out, of course, is a lot of revenue was being booked multiple times between what should have been the asset heavy models. A lot of their revenue was really billing each other for fiber related services and IRUs in these swap transactions, or even legitimate deals. Like if it was, AboveNet is an example, and this is true at level 3 as well. A lot of our customer base, a lot of our deals that were sold but not yet converted to revenue were with customers who were, maybe there was a legitimacy there, but the customers were running out of money themselves and they were going away. So it didn't matter if they signed an order or not, their business was done with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that was, and one of the things you mentioned in the book is the bandwidth trading, right? There's another example of something that didn't happen. I remember learning that there was another investor day for WillTel, which you referred to as WillTel 2 in your book, at WillTel, and their CTO, I believe, or COO was a woman, and her last name was Crow, and she would always joke about that, not being related to Jim. And we're at dinner and we're asking her, one of these more seasoned analysts was at my table, and so I was kind of soaking in everything he's asking, guy Dan Reingold, and everything he was asking the questions from. And so she's pressing her about the, why aren't you, the bandwidth trading and all this kind of stuff that's going on, and she said it's just and she was really pointing at Enron and because they were making, WillTel was doing some of this, but it was really Enron that was talking about this and what they were doing. And she finally slams her fist down. There's nothing to it. And like, what do you mean? They're trading the same contracts back and forth all day long, 100 times a day to make it look like there's volume. No one's involved in this business. And around the table, like, wow, that's kind of shocking. Because I would have investors call me about this. Say, hey, how could we get into this bandwidth trading? Because this is great. You can't get access to this by bandwidth futures and things which intuitively I said that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Because I'm new to this, but I learned that you can take a new electronics and put it on the fiber, and all of a sudden you can do 4 times as much. I don't know. I'm guessing that over the years that's going to improve. And so, how are we ever going to have have a shortage of that bandwidth in 10 years from now? That you're going to need to buy something forward to make sure you have enough capacity on the network, and you can just light up another fiber pair. And that's the thing, that the other incredible thing that until maybe very recently, a lot of the networks you bought that talk about all the dozens of fibers. How many they have? What, 2 pairs? And they'd never lit up any more than that because they just swapped out the electronics. Just an incredible how that technological innovation just really, again, kept these networks so far ahead of the game until really kind of what your model came with Zayo was having everyone deciding that, hey, I want my own set of fibers to do, and everybody could, then could afford and had the need for it.
And that was a legitimate evolution of the space driven by both the pickup of internet in general, but cloud computing, edge computing. Fibers play a big role in connecting equipment together in a data center. You go to a data center and you see tons and tons of fiber. Mm-hmm. It's not because the fiber is capacity constrained. It's that it's just easier just to connect a piece of fiber from one equipment to another equipment and not bother kind of trying to get too many different traffic flows down the same fiber. When it then became clear that you could do the same thing outside the data center to connect locations together, maybe equipment that existed in multiple data centers, maybe your headquarters back to your data center equipment, just use fiber as an interconnect platform. That was kind of a huge realization that, hey, there's a lot of demand for fiber itself, not because the fiber can't carry more capacity, because it's just cheaper and easier to lease some fiber, lease bundles of fiber and connect a bunch of equipment. And you're seeing that more and more of that happen even today with AI. And I think that's going to add a bunch of activity to edge of the network. So
absolutely.
When did you, do you have any recollections of like seeing the white in someone's eyes during that phase where either executive at a company, maybe another analyst, maybe an investor, when the magnitude of what was happening was starting to become clear and the all-out panic mode started to hit?
Yeah, it just, you would just see, and it was less so my companies, but the CLEX and these others that were just massively missing numbers, and then just the write downs they were taking, and the change, and then suddenly you'd see management changes, right? That same Quest CFO that berated me for 45 minutes about my, not having the right rating on his stock. A few months later, he's being like, I'm getting a call at 10 o'clock at night that he's leaving the company, and these guys kind of were management changes being pushed out. There was actually one we were looking at initially. I covered the data centers as well, and we were looking at some of those, and this must have been in early 2001, and my associate was an engineer, and he'd worked for a contracting firm up in the Baltimore area, and he learned that his old firm was building some of these data centers for Quest. And he walks into my office and his jaw's dragging on the floor. And I said, well, what's happening? What's going on? He said, well, I was looking into those data center things that you were telling me to look at. And I just talked to my old boss. And okay. He said, these guys are spending $250 to $275 a square foot to build these things. And now it's, multiples of that to build it. And I said, I didn't know anything about construction. Well, what does that mean? He said, we used to build clean ICU units for Johns Hopkins for about $125 a square. I've never heard of this. And I can tell from what he's telling me that he's added about a 10 to 15% pain in the ass factor on it because they want this done so quickly. And I was like, wow, if these things go bad, the bidding might start at these at 75 cents on the dollar. These things are a real problem. And of course we were off by about 74 cents, but that was, so you could kind of see where a lot of that was, that again, data centers, another thing where the idea was there, but it was just, if you're just getting a multiple on your capital, and you're just you buy $1 and I buy some servers and put it in a data center, it's worth $8. Suddenly bankers will just keep doing that until it doesn't work. Yeah. And then the other thing was, there's some parallels here to kind of, people don't want to draw parallels with what's going on with AI, but there's the biggest difference then was this was all very new. These were all brand new industries, and it was a lot of capital raised on the backs of average investors, a lot of retail investors, and not folks that necessarily had money to burn. And then it just, none of it, it was all fabricated. There was, again, we're back to things like the WorldCom margins. That was a complete fallacy. The whole thing, just a house of cards that fell down on that. Internet growing every 100 days. And these kind of things that were held up as just the standards of what's going to happen. And then, of course, like I said before, a dozen companies that only need 10% market share each to get to free cash flow break even. So that is, that math doesn't work. And it also assumes that the Bell's going to give up all their market share, which clearly, everyone, completely underestimated the Bell's longevity and staying power. And again, back to having real assets and real network. Which ended up being kind of the real delineating factor. But it got dragged down by all the other debt and all of the other equity that was raised for those asset light models that just completely went away.
Yeah, I think the regulatory restrictions on what the Bell companies could do probably saved them from doing maneuvers like Cincinnati Bell did. They probably dodged a lot of bullets that they wouldn't have otherwise dodged. So what about when you first started to realize the level of fraud, both in terms of, what WorldCom was doing was beyond what I think most were. But when you add up what WorldCom was doing, and then you take out all of the companies who were creating revenue in the form of swaps that would then drop 100% to the EBITDA line, and talking about how quick their businesses are growing and how robust they're, and then when the dust starts to settle, you realize that was all one big fabrication. Everyone had to have known it while they were pumping their stocks.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they definitely had to know. They definitely knew that. And that was where I started paying attention to, the sales, the stock sales and how much they were selling. And then you'd see, a stock was down 80%, and now the guy's just dumping stock like no tomorrow. That makes no sense. I personally, when I just looking back on it, of all that, besides WorldCom, of all the other ones that I cover, I thought Global Crossing was really the most egregious with what they had done with the swaps and how they had been, the way they had been, booking all the revenue and selling all the IRUs, and it doubled down and all of that. I thought that was, to me, that they were the most egregious.
At the same time, while this is all happening, Winnick's putting hundreds of millions of dollars in his pocket.
Right.
So
yeah. Exactly.
Jail time.
I got a few thoughts on that, but that was that was the one that I couldn't understand why they didn't get, they weren't investigated more, and more didn't end up happening to them. And you outline all those kind of pretty well in your book. Quest 2, you could see that was another one where you could the one that you could that I knew there was definitely something. I was recommending him, so I was really looking askance at Quest. So I kind of had a better view, a more balanced viewpoint for them. One of the things that people didn't, that I pointed out a lot to investors, with the CFO left, that was one of the most high-profile companies on the street, if not in the world, was Quest at the time, right? I mean, think of it as, pick whatever you think is the hottest, sexiest company in the world, and they're doing a CFO search. Everybody on the street is focused on this new CFO, and they promoted an unknown person from within. I had met her once at a Quest event, and they promoted her from within, and I thought, that's really interesting. Why? Really? Because every rock star CFO out there has got to want to come to this company, because there were some cracks there in the armor, but the wheels weren't coming up. But all of a sudden, they put her in place, and then you fast forward about a year, and when it all kind of fell apart. And I remember the thing that really got the SEC investigating them. When companies report numbers, there's the GAAP numbers, and then there's a lot of adjustments that are made to the numbers, some of which are things that are one time or not, not necessarily operational. And those are the numbers of the estimates people are focused on. It's called a pro forma number. So Quest puts out their I think it was it must have been 2000, maybe it's 2001 or 2002 fourth quarter report, and they just put out the pro formas. Now, when they filed the Q and all that, it had all the all the GAAP numbers, and I remember thinking, wow, that was really helpful because we didn't have to dig through to pull out all the pro formas. But that's what got all their attention. and buried in there, that was when the accounting shenanigans at Quest really took off. And I felt so bad because the woman they made, the CFO, she got, I can't remember what happened to her from a legal standpoint, but I remember reading, transcripts of her on at the trials and so forth, but they clearly took someone that was not, and put her in a position that they were kind of pushing her to make a lot of these decisions. It appeared from the outside that she didn't realize really what she was doing. And because she believed, why would my board and my auditors and my CEO be telling me to do these things if they're wrong? And but you could see those are some of the things that when I saw that announcement, I saw that appointment, and then certainly when you started seeing these guys just file and just out of nowhere, and the WorldCom was the one that took everyone's breath away. And if you kind of round the outside, like how could this not have happened? But that was the one, and that was the other thing that for many years the rating agencies that put ratings on the debt got caught flat-footed, and for years they would never put an investment grade rating on telcos. At one point, they were never going to put investment grade ratings on tower companies, because it was because they got caught with a rating on WorldCom when they went bankrupt, and they weren't going to be fooled again. And that was and again you look back at, and so you start to see. You see other patterns. You saw some similar patterns in the financial crisis and things like that. But I think it was the WorldCom was the one that really, if you didn't know things were bad, that's the one that woke everybody up.
So you mentioned earlier about your coverage of AboveNet in the post-bankruptcy era. Maybe using AboveNet as as kind of an example of how the industry began to recover from the depth of almost every company we talked about went bankrupt. And the few that didn't weren't because they were strong companies. It's because they, in case of level 3, we had enough cash at the time this started to hit. And we're able to use that cash to kind of work through the debt problems. But if you're a debt holder, you got maybe 30 or 40 cents back on the dollar, and somehow a little bit of the equity value was preserved without going through bankruptcy. But every one of these companies literally got destroyed and went through bankruptcy in the process. So maybe using AboveNet, and maybe also using this small rural telephone company called CenturyLink or CenturyTel at the time. Yeah, maybe using that story as well. So maybe build a perch and tell us about. Oh my gosh, I'm going to forget his name. The CEO of CenturyLink.
Glenn Post.
Glenn Post. So maybe use Glenn Post and Bill and kind of their profiles relative to what we've been describing these people to be like. What was Bill like? What's your earlier memories of him? Yeah. What were your earlier memories of Glenn Post?
Yeah. So, no, those are good. And then I got good, the how level 3 survived. I got a couple good stories there, but so Bill, like I said, they come out of the bankruptcy, they were trading back, publicly traded, and I'm like, hey, and I looked at it, and similar to kind of we described before, I looked at what AboveNet had. When I saw some of their network maps, especially, I remember the one that really, and I'm looking at like, these guys have incredible networks in these cities. And then I saw the one in London. I'm like, how on earth did they get, through all these, historic areas and all this fiber in right in the city center. And I just said, these assets are incredible. And so again, I could see where there's a lot of value, again, doing the hard work, getting local assets, getting in major metros where you can start to build networks that no one else is going to have. These now have value because you're not chasing residential customers, you're chasing enterprises and businesses, and you're starting to chase the ones that you talk to. And at the time, you I remember having a really interesting conversation with Bell South, and I asked them about how they compete against some of these carriers, like an AboveNet or TW Telecom or anybody else, for a small customer. They said, well, Frank, you have to understand, what all these small businesses need is Yellow Pages advertising. And so when they come to put their Yellow Pages advertising, that's when we get the sale. I said, that's really good to know. Hang up the phone, immediately start, looking at all these telcos. These guys aren't focused on this at all. So if you weren't billing, if you were billing under $10,000 a month, they weren't going to touch you. It wasn't worth their time. They assumed you were going to need your Yellow Pages ad, and you were just easy. So all these guys that were willing to, build a sales force, take a business where you're actually connecting fiber, so we have real assets going into a building. We can offer a real alternative that is, for disaster recovery purposes and redundancy and all those things that fiber needs to actually make that last mile connection to those businesses. Then it's not hard to get that. To get that business. So AboveNet had all that great network, and I was really impressed with Bill. I think he still gets my research. I hear from him from time, every once in a while. But I think he was very, very impressive, and I could absolutely tell he brought the company back, really built it out, and he had a good vision. And he was unlike some of the character matters. You could just kind of tell he really, really believes what he's doing and how he's building out this company. I said, I think this is going to work. And I, one of the it's, having a stock get taken out above your target price is not bad, but we like to cover stocks for long periods of time. So bittersweet when you acquired them. But
they would have gone private if we didn't acquire them. So they were going up.
Yes. That backstory in there was great. But again, it was back down to, here's a company that has assets that are very different, and not everyone has those types of assets to give them the revenue opportunity that an AboveNet would have. And then Century. So one of the very first two companies I launched on were Alltel and CenturyTel. And I went down I did what most folks do. Hey, you're going all the way down to Monroe, Louisiana, or Little Rock, so kind of do both. And so I went and saw Alltel, and then drove over to see Glenn and Stuart. And Glenn was the most gracious person out there. He's a true gentleman. I think very, very highly of him. And I knew, it was very obvious to him that I didn't know anything. And I was acting like I did. I was trying to make it up. And they were very, very polite. And to take my time. And I don't know who's more shocked that I'm still covering telecom from that first meeting, me or them. But I bet they would have thought, like, well, this guy's whatever, he'll be blown out in a year. But I'll tell you one of the most interesting stories about Glenn. They would take you to this little place for lunch, right? It's right on the bayou, and the Louisiana Tech water ski team is out there doing jumps and stuff. And I think they did this actually to put New Yorkers off their guard. Well, I'm from the South, so I sat down and ordered the fried okra and the sweet tea and all that kind of stuff, and it didn't faze me at all. But we're sitting to have this conversation, and Glenn says, "Excuse me," and so he stands up, and I'm trying to talk to Stuart, and I'm watching him out of the corner of my eye, and I watched Glenn go around to the entire restaurant. Almost everybody in the restaurant was one of his employees. He knew them all by name. He shook their hand. I could hear, and I'm trying to listen. He's addressed them by their first name, and he went around to every single person of those employees and spent time, and then came down and sat down. I was nobody, at the time, but I just said, here's a CEO who clearly cares about his employees and is, having a meeting with an analyst, but that's not what was really, really clear to him. And he didn't have his name on the, I always drive up to the company office, and I see, does the CEO have his own private parking space right there by the building, right? Or is it a space for the employee of the month, kind of thing? And he didn't have anyway. So Glenn, and at the time they were about to have a whole million access lines, because they were in the process of buying some of the access lines, I think from US West, and then also for which ended up kind of Quest still sold them at the time when they took them over, and then also from Verizon, and then just kept acquiring more. And then it was just a machine of them buying, and they were very, very good at M&A. And I think ultimately that company was very, very good at M&A. They're very good at identifying assets and acquiring them and assimilating them. That game, and they were very good at that. And they saw where the company needed to go. And so they made a lot of efforts. And I think that's what buying Quest was. I think they bought some hosting companies, and so they bought Savis, was a company that I covered, a data center and hosting company that I covered that then ended up getting sold out. But they saw where the industry needed to go. I think it was just harder to actually get it there from where they needed it. But that's how they ended up buying all those assets and ultimately acquiring Level 3, merging with them. But they were great, and I've had conversations with them over the years after they left, Glenn and Stewart, after they left the business. Most recently talked to Stewart about some things that were going on in the industry about 18 months ago. They're always very helpful, but they were really easy to deal with. Very straight up. There were a couple of times when you had some short investors that were trying to attack them on accounting integrity and stuff, and I would say, yeah, bring it. That's the wrong company to talk about accounting irregularities and their integrity. That you are complete. I know you're wrong from the get-go. They're very, very straight guys. But I always enjoyed covering that company. They were very, very useful with their time, and learned a lot from them.
Yeah, and in both examples, you contrast that to the personalities of the big boom time, which were gregarious people telling huge stories and and being aggressive in their personalities. And then you got these two examples, Glenn and Bill, who are have completely different backgrounds.
Yeah.
They're blocking and tackling type CEOs, building up their businesses, huge loyal kind of teams behind them, and over a period of a number of years, are rebuilding the industry kind of from the ground up. So you mentioned Level 3, some stories of Level 3 as they somehow avoided.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, there were two things that and I don't know who the bankers were that worked on these, but they earned every dollar of their fee. One was the one where they sold equity at, I don't know, $125 or $135 a share. Also issued a couple $1 billion of debt. And a top ticket. It was, if you look at a chart of the Lumen, and I guess it's in Lumen now, and you go back to it was sometime in 2000, maybe as early 2001, but it's 2000, and they top ticked it. I mean, they sold it at the absolute top, and they added all this debt to it. I wasn't covering the company, but I get this call from our bankers in Charlotte. They said, "Hey, have you ever heard of this company?" I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Yeah, I have." Like, what do they do? I said, they do the same thing these other companies I'm working on. It's really, it's fiber networks. They're really important. And they said, well, they're offering a deal. They want us to be into the debt and the equity. They can pay us $1 million fee. The price is in 15 minutes. So, yeah, do it. And they did. And it was absolute perfection by the bankers. Now, the stock went straight down from there, but and split adjusted, it was a huge share price there, but absolutely top ticket. But getting all that capital, that then kind of saved the business, and the debt wasn't that expensive at the time, and so they were able to really weather that storm. And I think that part saved them. The other thing that saved them was this thing where they had revenue covenants in their debt. And that cannot be understated. I've never seen that before. We'll probably never see it since. But what that basically meant for people, if you look at any kind of company issues debt, there's certain covenants. Hey, you can do certain things, you can't do other things, and they restrict certain things you can do. Well, in this case, you had revenue. You had to hit certain revenue thresholds, and they had what I think was a relatively loose definition of what the revenue was. So they bought a bunch of software companies, because you can scale software up very quickly. At one point, my joke was, I don't cover Level 3 because I'm not qualified because I'm not a software analyst. And over 50% of the revenue were software. So Jim went out and he bought all these software companies, and that kept them afloat because they never broke their covenants.
I won't go through this earlier, but importantly, they were companies that were classified as software companies, hence meeting the definition in the covenants. But the companies they were buying weren't really software companies. All they would do is resell Microsoft software, because Microsoft needs someone to manage all these licenses. So companies would have a whole bunch of revenue, top line revenue. 97% of that would just be shipped over to Microsoft. So they have almost no margin, and hence the companies would be really cheap on a multiple revenue, because you're really only buying 3% of the revenue you got to keep. The other went to Microsoft. So for very little bit of cash, you could overpay for these companies. So the people behind them are like, holy shit, I had no idea we were worth that amount. But that's what saved.
But they had another use for it because they needed to hit those revenue covenants.
Yeah,
so it was those two things really kind of kept the company going, where they probably would have hit a similar fate.
The other thing that helped too at about the same time was announcing that Warren Buffett was now investing.
It made an investment. Yep.
Now, in reality, Warren Buffett put in $100 million of that $500 million, and it was in a very structured deal where he was guaranteed to make money.
Yeah,
he would take it out right away.
Yeah,
he was a short-term investor who's kind of being paid to be an investor. But the brand of Warren Buffett got replayed for years to come, even well after he was kind of that tiny investor.
You're right. For years, I would have isn't this? But didn't Warren Buffett invest in that? And I'm like, yeah. let me show you the slide where he was basically mathematically guaranteed to be in the money, with this structure he had, and he's never put any money in since. But you're right. But he did, yeah. But that did help. The stock rode that for a long time.
So maybe take like a few steps back. What I'm going to do is hit two more things.
Yeah.
First, take a big step back and now reflect on this, the launch of the industry, the excitement of the late 90s, the big bust, the recovery back. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then I want to shift and look forward in the industry. Let's bring up to current day and kind of how you're making sense of what's currently going on, particularly in kind of the bandwidth fiber sector of the industry as you look forward in time. So the big step back, reflect on, this big boom bust recovery rebirth cycle. What do you think the big takeaways are?
Yeah. So let's see. I think it's been interesting to watch the use cases, right? So we watched, wireless, and then really LTE driving demand for wireless, need for fiber in a lot of those locations, for fiber in new locations. That's a conversation I had many, many times with folks like, well, didn't we build all that fiber in the 2000s? Like, yes, but there's a lot of places where they didn't build the fiber, 15 years ago or 25 years ago, and it needs to go there. So yeah, you do need some more, but now you actually have some use case. Start to see that filling up. Then watch, like I mentioned, the data center businesses, right? So look at the how that has come about, where the shift of the center of the telecom network and the center of the new central office, basically where all the switching used to happen, is now in a data center, and how important that is. That's been an interesting aspect to watch grow, and then see how specialization matters, where it makes a lot more sense for a company that this is all they do, to have the right kind of capital there into the business, to build a data center, and then going forward. Again, we're seeing other new use cases for how we're going to fill up this fiber, even this new demand for new types of fiber.
Yeah, before we go forward, part of what you talked about earlier that struck me in this conversation was how you would size up the people behind these companies, the leaders behind these companies, how they would come across, what you would look for. Do they have their own parking spot, or is it the employee of the month? In contrast that to earlier when, you are observing Nacho doing his Survivor game, you're like, something's not right about this. How have you been able to kind of develop your thinking about what to look for when you're assessing a company and trusting maybe you're now more developed instincts on the leaders behind the companies, and what signs reveal, hey, maybe this is not the right person to back, versus, hey, maybe this is the right person to back?
Yeah, and it's it's a big part of what sell side analysts do for folks that our investors, which are mostly institutional investors, but they really rely on us. Like, what do you think about management? How do you think? Do you think they, how do you think they'll be able to run and operate the business? a lot of it gets down to some of these smaller things, like how you see them treat people, because that's if they're treating, how do they treat the waiter or the wait staff when you're out at a dinner, or when we're on the road, how do they interact with folks at the airport and things like that. It's surprising how important that is. Do you, it's why important to play games like playing golf and doing other activities, right? You mentioned we got the shout out in your book from where you met Mark Ganzi, at our conference in Park City, but we do a lot of interaction with folks. And if you see why is somebody moving his ball in golf for a golf game that doesn't matter? And I'm playing terribly. You're definitely beating me anyway, but he moves the ball and doesn't take the stroke. Those kind of things. If that guy will do that there, he's definitely going to cheat you when it comes time to how he's going to handle the numbers. And then you just can tell if they do that. Are they being more forthright, or are they or not? You're asking probing questions and they're getting defensive, or they're trying to get frustrated with you. Those kind of things, you start to think, that's not right. Or you sit there and they, oh, that's a very good question. They give you a reason why they can't answer your question. There's legitimate reasons why they can't tell you everything, and how available they are, and that sort of thing. And then the other is always how does a company treat you if you're recommending the stock versus not recommending the stock. And they don't have to spend any time with you if they don't want to. But if they suddenly won't spend any time with you if you're not recommending the stock, then that tells you something. Maybe you're onto something, or at least they're not trying to be as fair and honest as they should be. If they only want people that are cheerleaders, and they only want and then if it's okay, if Frank's now negative on my story, what do I need to kind of convince him that something's different, what I need to show him, and they should do that for everybody. They should be fair and honest with everybody on the street,
or what they need to learn from kind of your assessment. Because one thing at Zayo, I was very transparent with our numbers, a lot of metrics, and part of it was because of what the industry had gone through. If you were showing kind of where the numbers were coming from, people couldn't just say, well, geez, this just sounds like a repeat of the story from 10 years ago. But it also gave the opportunity to get feedback from outsiders, because they could see what you're seeing. And, if there were things you weren't picking up on, you could almost crowdsource kind of the analysis function in some ways. Okay, so so thank you for all that, by the way, because hearing you think, how you assess beyond the numbers and beyond the strategies, but size up the leaders and how you can read between the lines, I think is a refresher for certainly me, and I suspect for all of us. So now look forward in the industry. So, we're many years later, and if you add up the value of all the pure bandwidth companies, there's very few companies, but if you add up all of their value, it's very low. I mean, add up Lumen and Zayo and the next tier down and all the really small ones, and and you get to a rounding your valuation compared to any one company that is built upon these platforms.
And you think of all the debt that got wiped out and the various bankruptcies and so forth. I mean, makes it even worse.
So how can bandwidth be so important? There now be largely consolidated industry, yet it's not reflected in kind of rapid growth of valuations of companies.
Yeah, I think the telecom industry was not set up as a regulated monopoly for no reason. It is, and say it's the term natural monopoly, it gets thrown around, but there was some logic to why some of those things were there, and it's just not always an industry that favors multiple competitors. You can be two competitors in an area can still beat each other up, and sometimes it's a third one, or sometimes it's the fourth one, and then all the cash flow can evaporate because you've got the fixed costs you put in, the incremental cost of adding some more bandwidth and so forth really can get beaten up. And then when there's second or third options, you see a wireless carrier, if there's fiber to a tower, you think, well, there's no economics for someone else to build fiber. But if the wireless provider really wants to beat them up, they can probably convince someone else to build in, and then it's just kind of a race to the bottom. But I think it really gets to that aspect of the other options that the customers have. So when you have 2 or 3 different providers in the same area, it's really easy for everybody just to cut price, and the industry doesn't really hold itself to that. Cable companies do a better job of that. They protect their base. But in the fiber, that's kind of what's happened. Now, remains to be seen with some of these newer business models. What I understand, the hyperscale AI providers, they value speed to market. They value where this is being built. They recognize that that this is definitely not something they're going to do themselves. You could argue about whether a Microsoft, is going to go back to a lot more self-provisioning and building data centers, things like that. That's probably on the slower downward slope, but they're definitely not necessarily going out and constructing and building networks. And they're willing to help their customer vendors underwrite to much better returns than you would have seen maybe with large fiber to the tower deals or things like that. That's positive. Other things. So for if I understand the Lumen deals that they've done, their customers can't resell that fiber, right? So that's helpful. And these are brand new routes that they've gotten, and so if you lock in those economics earlier, that's better. But it's really just been a matter of way too many providers and everybody having low marginal cost, and then the desperation from years ago trying to make a number or make a debt payment, pushing the revenue down. But I think that's kind of what it gets down to. So going forward, I think you're going to see people more disciplined about how these networks are built. And that the scarcity value of what they're building, is probably what'll help out.
And I think there still is the new generation of leaders of these bigger platforms. They almost have to relearn some of the lessons that we're learning in the past, because the discipline of running the business in a way where you're going to have bottom line cash flow to show for what you're doing. I think there still is an evolution in front. Like, how do you mentioned cable companies have learned to do that really well, and part of it is the industry understanding how to not to, cut each other off at the knees, because then everyone's going to fall over. And
right.
So how when you have because there is a lot less competitive rivalry now, than even 5 years ago. How does that start to translate into better results?
And the good part is a lot of the companies behind this, this is cash they can afford to lose. I'm sure they wouldn't think of it that way, but this is not like it's a business with no revenue and it's a brand new thing and we hope it's going to work. And we've raised all the money. These are some of the biggest, most well-capitalized companies in the world, and they're out building things that they clearly see demand. They're generating revenue from AI. They're generating revenue from these things today. And then these networks are pretty important. The other thing gets into, that you touched on, in some of your other podcasts is access to power. I mean, that's what you're really kind of chasing around the country. And then, okay, great. So we found some land, we found an agreeable grid, we found an agreeable utility commission that allow us to fire up an incremental 100 megawatts of power. Do we have fiber? And I've had some investors and some other trade groups call me and kind of pick my brain and some say, well, you might look where the fiber is going to be, because if there's a gas pipeline, you think that's going to be really great for where you're going to see a lot of value. If there's no fiber there, you got to get the data in and out of the data center. And so I think there's a lot more appreciation of how valuable that is and how difficult it is to really build these networks. I mean, what this industry did to build these things is incredibly challenging.
Yep. Any close? Well, we really didn't touch on Zayo. Maybe spend a couple minutes.
Yeah.
When Zayo started to come on the scene, what were your early impressions? And then you pretty much followed us throughout. So
yeah,
how did that play out in your mind as someone who was an analyst looking in?
Yeah, I mean, so like, I remember I was John Siegel at Columbia Capital introduced me to you and met the company and Ken and knew you guys before you went public, and then followed the business, and it was one of those, and I think I remember, you I think you talk about it in your book, but your whole analogy of, people having a tequila issue and just kind of, not wanting to go back. And it's a great analogy for why people didn't want to go back, but you absolutely saw kind of where a vision was going. And I see, and I could see where that was happening. Then you saw with the broader and broader cat fiber to the tower deals. And then everyone you talk to, you could see the carriers couldn't model their own growth. It's almost like, the hyperscalers and cloud companies now have a really difficult time modeling their growth. The wireless carriers at the advent of LTE and couldn't really had a hard time modeling their growth, because everyone you talked to said, yeah, they're buying lit services and they want 100 megs, or they, or something, and they want 100 gigs. Wait a minute, no, they just want a dark fiber, and they really quickly kind of accelerated there, and they were growing. They needed that so rapidly to build out the network, and you guys right at the forefront of that. And then you built all this, all this fiber, and then you were at the forefront of getting into data centers, which I was following. So all that seemed to make a lot of sense. But it was interesting you talk about in your book about how I always, the Verizon kind of shooting themselves in the foot and going to their one fiber solution and doing it all themselves. I've seen them do that a couple of times where they do something that appears kind of irrational. Why would they do that? Why would they do that? And I don't know whether it's egos and so forth, but that was, again, it was the demand was there and the need was there, but that kind of hurt, was challenging for your business model. And then I think the other thing the thing that investors always, it was so frustrating that would miss. You guys would beat numbers, but like you mentioned, the data you gave a lot of data that no one else gave, and it gave us a lot of insight in how the industry worked. Looking at the install base and then the churn, what's the net installs and so forth. And we had all those model. I pulled up my old model, and you guys kind of give myself a refresher. And you laid it out how the business worked, and no one else reported that. No one. You have other companies that had no drivers. There was nothing you were basing the business on. It's just and so at least if you have access lines or you have a number of wireless subscribers, I have something that I can base a model on. And then a lot of these other, because there's no drivers or anything, and you guys always gave that. But then there was always some metric that wouldn't quite go up, and the street would beat you up on it. And I always thought that was really kind of unfair to you guys. So I think the vision and the growth and the business was there, but the street would end up focusing on something that really didn't matter, and it was incredibly frustrating to me, watching that part of it happen. And then you did a lot of M&A, which was interesting, and then bought Electric Lightwave, which I had covered, and a bunch of these other companies that we all kind of knew about, but eventually that kind of stopped, and then that's kind of when it comes the next evolution of the business, and that's where you guys ended up in the sale process. And I think you were looking at several different things, maybe splitting the company in a couple of parts, maybe selling off the data centers, which you had a really valuable part of the business there with Zcolo. That I talked to investors a lot. That was kind of a hidden asset, but it was harder for people to see. But I think that would have been the right thing to do. I think you're also considering converting to a REIT. I think that would probably have created some value as well. But look, you guys were at the forefront of kind of where, when you look back on, it's like, well, of course we need fiber in all these places. That was not 10 years ago. That was not the foregone conclusion, and that was an uphill battle with investors who, again, still kind of thought of the world. That was that telecom blow up from 10 years ago. Why are these guys trying this again? I said, no, this is actually very, very different. And I think for me, and I think the last thing I'll say for me is, again, having understood TW Telecom, having understood a lot of the local phone business and that part of the demand, and where you guys had built fiber and the assets that you put up, is very clear that you built up a very, very valuable set of assets that was really, really difficult to replicate and probably couldn't. The one thing that I don't think you guys ever really could articulate it, but it was very obvious that there was something in the tens of billions of dollars of invested capital that you guys had acquired for almost nothing. And there was had they overpaid for some of that or overbuilt? Maybe, but just the sheer challenge of building all of that fiber, you weren't going to replicate it. And there was clearly a need and a demand for it.
Yep. Well, that's probably a good way to stop. I mean, the sale's still, cranking along. I think the last year or so has been good for Zayo, but they're still figuring out how to run the business in a way that produces value, creates value, and but I think the set of assets they have and kind of the world where we continue to navigate to plays in their favor and plays in Lumen's favor, and I think a lot of it comes down to just getting better and better at the blocking and tackling aspect of running these types of business models. But
they'll clearly have a lot of opportunities going forward with the way the world is going. I mean, that network that Lumen sold, no one, that's a one-off, but all of the most of the deals going forward, I think there'll be a lot more competitors, and Zayo is pretty well positioned for that. So it'll be interesting to keep watching that business and how Steve's running that. I think he's doing a good job.
Yeah, and hopefully it comes public again, and you'll be able to cover it all over again.
My Rolodex always recycles. It's so we'll see. So I'll definitely look forward to that.
Great, and I really appreciate you spending this time and telling the old stories and kind of how it would have been from a young analyst perspective. And I think that's fascinating, and really glad we were able to do this.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time to listen to what I have to say, and really enjoyed it. This is great. Thank you.
All right, Frank. Take care.
All right, take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe on your listening platform. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Courtney Caruso with support from Kendall Weinberg, Emily Reed, and Gibson Siegert.